So what I'd like to do is just really um, review and summarize really the clinical need that drives our strategy and our approach in OIA. Most of this won't be new to anybody, but I think it's really important for us not to lose uh, sight of our mission, what we are trying to achieve, why it's important, what we are trying to achieve, and how we are going to do it. I think this is particularly important for companies at our young stage, because otherwise losing sight of what's important can sometimes mean that we may feel a bit disconnected with the overall goals of the company. So what I want to talk about is why we are here, why the company exists, what we are trying to do, and how we propose to do it. Um, the why question, I believe, is really the most fundamental aspect of the existence of any organization or any company. So why does OIA exist? Well, our ultimate aim is to reduce death, disease, and suffering. And this is a bold aim, and we make no uh, uh, apologies for having these bold aims. We want to be able to improve health and well-being of patients and normal people worldwide, and ultimately we want to make the world a better place. There's no doubt about it that that is a bold claim, and it's difficult to sort of snigger at that sort of aim. But actually, you can make the world a better place one person at a time, right? One patient at a time. And that's how we aim to start, but we do have very high aims, and we want to truly make a difference. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to help ultimately to reduce death, disease, and suffering and improve health and well-being? Well, what we want to be able to do is to allow clinicians to diagnose diseases better, more accurately, more quickly, and more efficiently. The cost is important because we want to make diagnostic tests available to all patients, regardless of where they are and what their resources are. We want to be able to allow clinicians to monitor disease much more effectively than can be done at the moment. This means being able to monitor individual patients in an accessible manner to gather data in order to be able to help clinicians manage their conditions. And we want to bring on board state-of-the-art analytical methods in order to be able to really gain new insights and make new discoveries related to health and disease based on the information that we are generating. Ultimately, this is about improving physical health and mental health, both in state of disease, but also during times of health. Ultimately, we believe, and we're not alone in this, that actually this better monitoring will be able to prevent disease and ill health. So how are we actually going to take concrete steps towards these broad aims? Well, our start is to revolutionize how we image, how we quantify, and how we characterize cells. Okay, visualization, quantification, and characterization of cells. What we hope to be able to do is to integrate data about cells in the blood and in other compartments of the body in the future. But we want to be able to integrate this data really in a paradigm shifting method to be able to generate new insights. We're starting with blood cells, partly because they are fundamental to health and disease, and really changes in cells in the blood either are responsible for much of disease or are responsible for the recovery or the treatment of those diseases. Importantly, blood cells are very complex. Really, the purpose of this diagram is to show some of the diversity of some of the cells in the blood. The details aren't important, but the key point here is that by closer characterization of cells in the blood in a manner that it is available to everybody in the world will allow us to make great advances. It is possible currently to analyze blood cells to really a high degree, except that opportunity only is available to a small proportion of the people in the world. So this is one of the things that we want to change. Of course, as everybody knows, blood cells are two main types. There's the white blood cells, and these are involved in a range of conditions, including infections by bacteria or viruses, for example. They're important in cancers, both blood cancers, but also when it comes to using treatment of other cancers, such as chemotherapy agents. There are many conditions, such as autoimmune conditions, where the immune system attacks the body itself, and examples include bowel disease or diabetes. But it's now increasingly recognized that actually the immune cells, or the white blood cells, are also important in the pathology and the treatment of many other conditions, including heart disease, strokes, and mental health, of course. Now, these are the roles of white blood cells in some of the key diseases and pathologies. But of course, white blood cells are also integral to all stages of health, not just in aging and growing old, but also in response to pregnancy, exercise, and so on. So white blood cells are a complex collection of cells that are integral to health and disease. Similarly, red blood cells, of course, are important for and critical and essential for carrying oxygen around the body. So many conditions of anemias where there's low blood cell are common conditions that may be treated. There may be red cell abnormalities, so you would have heard of conditions such as sickle cell disease or thalassemias. And of course, red cells themselves can be the subject of infections, including in malaria. So there are huge numbers of important applications whereby monitoring red blood cells are important, and that's what we've been focused on for some time. But actually, of course, we are now in a new crisis, very unusual in that it is a global crisis that actually affects all corners of the world. I have just come out of a teleconference in Abu Dhabi who are telling me that actually how they are trying to deal with this problem. Now, COVID-19 is specifically relevant to us, not because, as Hector said, there's a bandwagon to join on, but actually this makes the point of how our technology and our approach could actually be useful in this type of scenario. There's clearly an urgent unmet need for being able to conduct blood tests. So I'll give you the example of my own patients. So the problem that we have, I'm a transplant surgeon, as you know, and we have patients who have had a transplant and are on immunosuppression. So what we normally do with these patients is that we bring them to clinic either twice a week or once every 2 weeks or once every month, depending on how old the transplant is. And the purpose of bringing them to hospital is twofold. One is to see them and to ask them questions and conduct a clinical interview. But really, the key reason that they need to come into hospital is because we need to do a blood test for them. And now we are facing a real problem in Addenbrooke's Hospital, is that actually we don't know what to do with these patients. We don't want to bring them into hospital where there is a risk of them contracting COVID-19. But the problem is that if we don't bring them to hospital, we don't know how to do blood tests on these patients. We can't send them to their GP to have their blood tests done because they have a similar problem. And actually, I can tell you as of now, we don't have a solution for this. We don't know what to do with these patients. And in fact, the solution that we have adopted so far is that we've stopped doing blood tests on many of these patients, which is clearly not in their interest, but there's a risk-benefit analysis. Now, this need for performing blood tests on COVID-19 in the scenario of COVID-19 applies to patients with cancer and transplantation and chronic conditions that would normally have regular blood tests, but of course also applies to patients with suspected COVID who are at home. As you know, for example, the advice is that actually if patients have got suspected COVID, they should not attend hospital. But the problem is that if these patients get an added infection, for example, a bacterial infection, they may need antibiotics. But it's very difficult to make that diagnosis without actually seeing the patients and without having access to blood tests. The truth is that remote blood testing will save lives. If it is not in this condition, which it will be, but it will be in the future. So I feel very strongly we, as every other person in our societies, we have an opportunity, but also an important obligation to join the fight against COVID and beyond. And other people are doing it. What this fight against this particular pandemic, remarkably, as you can see, has been fought by postman deliveries, but the people who are stacking shelves in the supermarkets, by people who are delivering food and other supplies, as well as by the, if you like, the traditional people who are normally charged with the task of fighting disease. So actually, we as a company and individually have a real opportunity to make a difference here. COVID-19 aside, I would like to show just a few slides on some of the other applications of our technology. So currently in the UK, every year there's about 164,000 patients that die from cancer. A substantial proportion of these patients receive chemotherapy. And one of the potential side effects of chemotherapy is that, for example, it can affect the immune system and expose patients to infections. The ability to monitor these patients more regularly, more efficiently, and more closely would be a potential paradigm shift in the treatment of these patients. Leukemias, or cancers of the blood, affect almost 5,000 or cause almost 5,000 deaths. Again, these are the sort of problems that we are helping to solve. Our role in solving these problems is a small one, but an important one. So we are not proposing to eradicate leukemias, for example, but actually what we are trying to do is to make it a little bit easier for clinicians to be able to actually deliver their care and monitor these patients. One of the consequences of giving patients chemotherapy agents, for example, in the context of cancer, is that their white blood cells can be reduced to such a level that actually these patients succumb to infections. Again, being able to diagnose these conditions earlier and be able to monitor them not only could affect the patient's health, physical health, but also, of course, their mental well-being and their can be emotionally very important and improve their quality of life. There's about 37 million people that are globally affected by HIV/AIDS. So what happens in HIV, as I'm sure everybody knows, is that a subset of the white cells in the blood are infected by the virus. And what happens is that over time, if this disease is not treated, the number of these white cells decreases until such time that the numbers is so low that the patient succumbs to other diseases. So the idea that the monitoring of these white cells in the blood are important is well established. And these white blood cells can be monitored quite readily, for example, if you have HIV or AIDS in a developed country such as the UK. But actually in some parts of the world, actually patients who are diagnosed with these conditions are never followed up because the opportunities aren't there. So what happens is that the diagnosis is made, they may be on treatment for some time, and actually the regular monitoring isn't done. The impact of being able to monitor these patients remotely, wherever they are in their own hometown or village, could make a substantial impact by being able to predict when the number of white cells are decreasing and therefore these patients are exposed to infections. One of the other applications of our technology is in the area of antibiotic resistance. Many of us have had the experience that, for example, we may have a sore throat, a cold, a common cold, and we visit our doctor. And really the diagnostic problem here, or the question is this a viral infection, which is most likely to be the case? And when it's a viral infection, it doesn't need antibiotics. Or is it a bacterial infection, in which case it does need antibiotics? Many of the general practitioners that see patients in clinic actually sometimes aren't able to definitively make this diagnosis. Many patients demand antibiotics because they feel that they would be better treated if they were receiving antibiotics. One of the consequences of this, for example, is that antibiotics are used in many cases unnecessarily. This leads to the rise of the problem where bacteria develop resistance to these antibiotics. And this has been predicted to in Europe alone. So one of the things that our technology will eventually be able to do is to be able to give clinicians the opportunity to perform a blood test very quickly to look, for example, for the signs of infection in the blood by examining the number of white cells in the blood. Malaria is one of the biggest killers annually in the world, almost 500,000 deaths every year. This is a disease that affects the red blood cells, as I mentioned earlier. And actually, the ability to be able to make a diagnosis of malaria accurately and remotely without having to attend the hospital would make a huge impact to the treatment of these patients. I mentioned sickle cell disease and thalassemia. So these are disorders whereby the red cells in the blood have an abnormal shape for a variety of reasons, usually because of genetic reasons. This affects actually a large proportion of the population of the world, particularly in certain parts of Africa and certain parts of Asia. Again, the ability to be able to monitor the shape of red blood cells remotely and easily at home, for example, could make a huge impact to the treatment, to the monitoring and the treatment of these patients. Finally, I mentioned anemia. So an insufficient amount of red blood cells in the blood. This affects, as you can see, 1.6 billion people manifest through a whole series of different symptoms and signs, some of which are listed on this slide. Again, the idea at the moment is that somebody who has anemia may be monitored with regular blood tests. But actually, the idea that we may be able to allow these patients to have more regular monitoring of their blood tests at home, and therefore their treatment being adjusted, could make a substantial impact. I want to finish off by really coming full circle back to the idea that actually it's really important that everybody is aware of what we are trying to achieve and what the mission of the company is. So there's a story, probably never happened, but there's a story that John F. Kennedy was visiting the NASA headquarters for the first time in 1961. And when he was touring the facility, he introduced himself to a janitor, somebody who was cleaning the toilets. This person was mopping the floor, and Kennedy asked him what his job at NASA was. And the janitor who was cleaning the floor said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon, sir." Now, this janitor clearly understood it. He understood that actually his part in this mission was absolutely vital. And that's where we are now with COVID. Actually, the people who are stacking the shelves at the supermarkets up and down the country, these are the people who are also fighting COVID. It's a simple fact that actually if the supermarket shelves weren't stocked up, if those delivery drivers didn't deliver food and supplies, that actually nobody would be able to fight this disease. So when people ask you or others what your role is, actually we're not writing codes, we're not designing algorithms, we're not developing software, we're not building hardware. I mean, those are just tools that we are using. And ultimately, our mission and our purpose is to actually save lives or improve people's lives with a variety of conditions, but most importantly, and right now, with COVID. So the project that Argo will talk about, Project Lancelot, actually is born out of that. It's our responsibility, and we have a moral duty and obligation to actually play our part in trying to solve this problem.